to the theme of March of accelerating change to solve water and sanitation crisis. Can you just talk to us a little bit about what that theme means to you?
Thank you very much. And indeed, I think it's a good starting point because that theme runs across the year. And indeed, if you look at where we're coming from, we have a crisis on the continent of Africa because of the very low coverage figures for sanitation, where we have about 880 million people without access, to safe sanitation facilities. And we have a third of the population without access to safe water and sanitation on the continent. Now, when you look at open defecation, the figures are very high. This affects the hygiene, this affects and creates a disease burden on the continent that must be addressed. The diarrhea cases of children that are dying, 380,000 children dying from diarrhea-related diseases every year. That's a waste of life, So it is a crisis. And therefore, there is need to accelerate the solution. There is need to improve access to water, access to improved sanitation, so that we get rid of all these unnecessary deaths. We get rid of all these unnecessary hospital bills that are coming as a result of poor sanitation and no access to water. So there is a crisis. We do have a crisis because of the very large numbers of people that do not have access to water and sanitation. Now, one thing that you must remember is that the population is increasing. So that number is not remaining static. As long as we are not providing services or we are not beating the population growth rate, it means the number of people that have no access to water and sanitation is increasing, So the need to accelerate is first to beat the population growth. We need to beat the population growth so that our growth in terms of access to water and sanitation is far much faster than the population growth. Now, the situation has been worsened by the impacts of climate change, and water suffers the brunt because when we have droughts, one of the ways in which climate change impact manifests, the people suffer, the animals suffer, the population and much of the industry also suffers because they have no access to water. So we are saying that we want to improve that. We want to increase climate change resilience by improving access to water. So whether there is a drought or there is no drought, people need to have access to water, to drinking water. Look at the Horn of Africa. They have been in a 3-4 year drought and millions of animals have died. How many livelihoods have been affected by that? So we are saying that instead of losing such large numbers of animals and lives of people as well, how many children have failed to go to school as a result of that drought? So there is an urgency to accelerate, to increase the pace of providing services to water and sanitation.
Is there a simple solution for this? What can be done?
No single country by itself can resolve it. It requires partnerships because it's not just a question of money. It's also a question of the approach that you use, the technologies that you are applying. One needs to also look at, is what I'm putting in place sustainable? You don't want to put in something today, tomorrow you have to go back and put in another thing. One needs to look at issues of sustainability. And so what we are advocating for is partnerships. There is need for partnerships. Partnerships between the countries and development agencies, the countries and financing institutions, as well as the private sector. The private sector also have a role to play. When we look at issues of improving efficiency, the private sector are very good at that. Innovating, the private sector are very good at innovating. So we need everyone on board. We need the NGOs that are involved in water. They are very good at mobilizing the communities And not only that, but ensuring that there is inclusivity. There is no one being left behind. The poor need to have access to water just as much as the middle income and the rich. And the non-governmental organizations, civil society, are also very critical in this space. So there is need for genuine partnership, and then we also need to mobilize increased resources, financing resources, climate change resources that are being made available. We need to mobilize that, and so that we have a critical mass, to tackle this problem as quickly as we can. Now, the one other aspect that is very important is we need not look at water, because if you look at water and the SDG targets, water nearly affects all the other SDG targets. I think of the 17, 15 targets cannot be met without meeting the SDG 6 on water and sanitation. So we need an integrated approach. We need an integrated approach where we are addressing related issues in ensuring that, yes, we solve water problems, but we also build in empowerment of youth, addressing poverty, addressing elements of health issues, and so on and so forth, education, and so on and so forth.
When you speak about water, people think, well, it's a natural resource, right? Africa has a wealth of natural resources. Is it something, using initiatives that nature can help solve to some extent?
That's an interesting question, but I've heard of it where people say, well, God gave us the water. Right. Yeah. But how many people are living very close to the river so that they just get the water out of that river and drink it? Many of the people live hundreds or very far away from where the rivers are, So one needs to understand that, and that water may not be of the quality that is potable, So it needs to be treated, it needs to be transported, it needs to be stored so that it's available to the individuals, to the people, as and when it's needed. The same for industry, the same for agriculture, And so we cannot leave it to nature. We have to manage nature, we have to manage, we can't manage nature, we have to harness it, we have to manage this resource and make it available to the population in quality and quantity that is sustainable.
In terms of partnerships, public sector, private sector partnerships, what are some partnerships that you've seen in terms of funding and that has been progressive?
There are quite a lot of partnerships. I'll give a few examples of please. Partnerships that I have worked very well. Let me begin maybe with the private-public partnerships, where the private have come in, financed a piece of infrastructure. I'll give you an example of the Kigali bulk water, where the private have come in, they have developed an intake. An intake is abstracting water from a river, treating it, and then making it available to a public utility to distribute to the population. Okay. So there is a partnership between the private and the public, the government, the public institution, where the private has developed that infrastructure for treatment and selling the water to the public institution to distribute. That's one partnership that has worked. But there are also other partnerships where the development finance institutions come in to partner with the government to finance projects. That's basically one of the things that we are doing. We lending money to the governments, to the private sector to develop this infrastructure for water and sanitation. Now, that is another form of partnerships. But there is also a partnership that is not necessarily for resources, but partnership for knowledge,
Okay,
partnership with people that have expertise in a certain area. You bring them on board, so that they bring that expertise to bear and you get the results. That ensures that there is sustainability in the provision of water and sanitation, and that it's affordable. it's affordable, and in also ensuring that there is inclusivity. We are not leaving anyone behind. So these partnerships come in different forms. These partnerships come at various levels. It's not just financial partnership, which is quite very critical also.
Okay, and so what are some future plans? Are there any future plans, future projects that the bank is currently working on in terms of water and sanitation?
Yes, there are a lot of plans. For each country, what we do is we go into policy dialogue, and identify areas where we support a country for the next 3 years.
Yes.
Yeah, some of the plans, for example, in rural areas where we have for a long time used a hand pump, to draw water from the ground. You drill a borehole and then you come with a hand pump and you're getting water out. One of the things that we are moving to is the use of the water energy food nexus. So we are using more of renewable energy. We are using solar power, to power the pumps so that they bring out water from the ground, using the God-given sun, and it is stored and made available to the population. Now, this allows us to have mini networks, of water supply. Instead of having just a hand pump, you can have a mini network from the one same borehole, where you had one hand pump,
Yes.
by putting a solar panel and a pump there with an elevated tank, you are able to distribute to a community of a few thousands in a fairly short period. So these are some of the approaches. Sanitation is another area that is also very, very critical, and there is a lot of innovation that has come through, because, for example, we are targeting urban sanitation, for the areas that are not sewered, providing a technology and an approach where the waste is contained, it's collected, treated, and you recover resources from there. You are able to generate biogas. You are able to get organic fertilizers in forms of solids, and which is later reused, So there is quite a lot of innovation that is coming in and creating business for young people, for youths, because that containing, the emptying, someone has to do it.
Yes.
That transportation, someone has to do it. And the treatment that goes on. Now, what does this do? You take away the waste without having to invest in very expensive piping system. Piping is very, very expensive. When you are doing sewerage and you do piping, because you have to follow gravity, or sometimes you have to pump, and you have to take it off to a far off place where the treatment is taking place, and many a times with quite limited recovery of materials from there. So the approaches have evolved, and we now have a situation where we are able to recover a lot more resources. It's within a localized place without having to do a lot of spending a lot on the transportation.
So more economical.
It's more economical.
Okay, good.
So that way we are able to accelerate the investments, because in the past you needed to spend a lot more millions, to ensure that there's access to a community. But with this approach, with the limited amounts, you are able to ensure that everyone has access to safe sanitation.
Okay, that's great. And so now just taking it away from more of the bank and speaking about individuals. As individuals, what can we do to contribute to aiding in sustaining the water in terms of climate change?
So that's a very good question, because individuals play a very important role.
Right.
I think the starting point for individuals is to be conscious of water wastage. That this is a resource that is finite, that it costs a lot to bring water to the premises, and therefore people need to be water wise, in the way that they use the resource. A typical example is when mothers are cleaning, for example, are doing their dishes, in the kitchen, they leave the tap running to wash one little dish,
Yes.
when brushing our teeth, a tap is running,
Yes.
use a glass and clean your teeth. So I think there are certain elements that will help in conserving water, but also to develop the discipline of paying for water. Water is not very expensive when you look at it, but because many people have the mentality that, oh, this is God's gift.
Right.
But remember that it has to be pumped, it has to be treated, and it has to be brought to your doorstep. So be mindful that there is a cost that goes in, and there are people that are working all around the clock to ensure that you have that service. So I think just being water wise in the way that we use, and also in the waste part of it, if we can develop the discipline of separating our waste, organic waste, glass, metals, we separate that,
Okay.
then it will become easier to reuse and to recycle some of these materials. Once we begin from there, once we become conscious of the costs involved in the treatment of our waste, in the bringing of these services, it will be a big step in improving even the attitude towards the paying for these services. The other aspect I think that we need to do is where sometimes, of course, you do have problems within a network. One may need to report and say, listen, there's a leakage here. The water company may not, or utility may not see it, but by reporting, you are saving yourself and the company a lot of dollars by stopping that wastage of water. In certain cases, there's also vandalism. These are being done by individuals, but by bringing this awareness, we are going to cut down on the vandalism, because when there is vandalism, the equipment is spoiled, but also the water is wasted.
Yes.
So we need to raise awareness against vandalism, against some still water, making illegal connections, and so on and so forth. If we can stop these vices, which are done by individuals, it will
Yes.
go a long way in improving the quality of services.
Thank you so much. Just one final question. What parts of Africa are we seeing the most, I would say the worst case of lack of water supply at the moment?
Okay, in terms of access, Sub-Sahara, as Africa, has some of the lowest numbers, in terms of coverage. Here in North Africa, in terms of access to water, it looks fairly good. The numbers are in the 80s, some in 90s of the population that is covered. Now, you realize that in some pockets in Sub-Sahara Africa, it is quite serious. The coverage levels, particularly for sanitation, is very, very low. And therefore, some extra effort needs to
Yes.
be made. Unfortunately, many of these countries are either in conflict, and it becomes a little
which makes
difficult,
the partnerships.
it's difficult to have interventions in these places because the security risks are very high. So we have challenges, quite a lot of challenges in Sub-Sahara Africa.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you for talking.